Apathy is not a disease, but a symptom. Here, it signals weariness. There, it betrays ignorance. Elsewhere, it is the result of a lack of structure in daily life. Apathy can arise from innumerable sources, similar to how a cough can present as an expression of both a chest infection and pneumonia. There is no quick fix to apathy. However, it is possible to isolate causal relations and attempt to correct them by degrees. That is what I hope to highlight in this video. A few likely sources of apathy, and my suggestions for dealing with them, both at the personal and cultural level. I will draw on my own observations as a relatively young person trying to navigate the current landscape, using philosophical insights, psychological conceptualizations, and anything else that might provide value in this matter. Number 1. Addressing the rise of atheism. First, let's talk about the elephant in the room. There appears to be a reasonable correlation between a lack of belief in divinity and apathy. Even as an agnostic, heavily leaning towards atheist, I can admit that the movement towards secularism presents significant challenges. It undermines most of our meaning-making frameworks and steals away the promise of the beyond. One might feel compelled, then, to make the logical leap to seeing all atheism as a disease, with religion or spirituality its obvious cure. However, I would caution people, even of spiritual or religious persuasions, against making this reductive move. It is very important to recognize that atheism is not a phenomenon that we can simply ignore or wish away. As societal threats diminish, or at least perceived to be diminished, certain parts of the brain appear to become less active to reflect this new situation, resulting in reduced belief. Whether or not divinity is real, the psychological trend directly affects the foundations culture has to build upon. So, honing in on the dynamics of atheism specifically, it is notable that there is not one unifying philosophy which connects all atheists. Rather, many competing valuations are occurring simultaneously in order to test, refine, and temper themselves. One of the most successful of these has been, ironically, the rejection of value. The common argument goes approximately as follows: we are all just floating on a rock through space. Nothing matters. The idea here is that one zooms out just enough so that every problem and suffering seems small and insignificant in the grand scheme of things. However, this has the unfortunate byproduct that every victory or joy is also made small and insignificant. There are subsets of atheists who are satisfied with this conclusion, and far more who have been swept up with it by happenstance, latching onto the only explanation which lends some small comfort. There is truth in this worldview. There isn't a privileged vantage point for viewing the universe. Atoms are no more meaningful than galaxies until a perceiving subject projects inner feelings onto them. However, trying to view life at this particular scale is clearly an unhealthy psychological projection. Life is being framed as a thing to shrink from, a thing to tolerate. It betrays a quiet stoicism which regards life with suspicion. I believe that the healthiest way for an atheist to view life is at the human perspective, creating meaning out of interactions and activities. For those still within religious or spiritual frameworks, I suggest using the motivation granted by faith, whatever its ontological origin, to assist in directing the atheist project from a place of strength, rather than attempting to curtail it. This means sharing what is valuable without insisting on metaphysical principles. No doubt, this will be more difficult, but nothing worth doing was ever easy. Number 2. Dealing with the loss of agency. Many people dismiss apathy as some kind of personal character defect, as if the person who is apathetic has willed themselves into inaction for fear of some consequence or discomfort. However, as scientific evidence mounts, there has been a growing, in my opinion justified, belief in the determinism of brain states, which has ironically led to a pendulum swing towards the opposite extreme. Increasingly, people are observing material conditions leading to certain behaviors and attributing blame here rather than to any individual choice. Under this worldview, it is very easy for modern people to lose their sense of personal responsibility and reject any notion of free will, which would have once been the motivator of action. While I do agree with the underlying premises of the more deterministic group, I believe the way that their ideas have been implemented have largely served to disempower people. It is entirely possible to keep the same ontological claims while framing them in an affirmative worldview. For example, I do not despair that my body naturally destroys and rebuilds my cells, or that I breathe without thinking, or that my heart beats on its own. I'm actually quite pleased with the arrangement. Why then should I be concerned that my behaviour is managed by a network of drives and impulses which are doing their best to navigate me through an ineffably complex world? The answer lies in anthropological history. Society operates more smoothly when every individual is constantly correcting behaviour to align with social contracts and the moral mores by ever smaller degrees. Thus, governments act to produce compliance through coercion and punishment. In response, we as individuals must produce narratives which try to forget the origin of this conditioning, framing self-discipline and responsibility as dignifying, elevating, perhaps even divine virtues. This process has been exposed in detail by thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche and Michel Foucault, and it reveals the artificiality of such notions. However, the concept of personal responsibility has proven essential to curing many of those ephemeral diseases which lead to apathy. To abandon it outright would mark a mere regression. My move has been to shift towards an outcome-based model, making responsibility an active, creative force, not a moral demand fueled by shame. I organise my life according to the goals that are most important to me, which are intentionally ambitious, contingent on discipline, and carefully evaluated. They don't rely on an essentialist concept of who or what I am in this exact moment, and they aren't based on my most fleeting whims, living for the moment, so to speak. From here, I seek out opportunities that in some way complement these goals, wherever possible. All that competes with them is naturally phased out, since the goals are so prominently centered in my life that they have woven into the fabric of my value judgments and motivations. This may not be suitable for all, but it is one example of reformulating responsibility after the mythic element is lost. Number 3. The effect separated from the entity. With the rise of liberalism, our philosophical outlooks now put far greater emphasis on individuation and experience, rather than the wide-scale results of behaviour. Where once the surrender of oneself to the status quo would bring one into the comforting myths of generational legacy, a civilizational project, or divine purpose, the current status quo is a blank canvas. So long as one does not truly threaten the system's ability to reproduce itself, all is permissible. The key distinction is that our apathy does not arise out of this conformity, as if it were the disease itself. Our apathy is instead a product of having our energies directed into the void. This has been exacerbated by increased psychologization of actions and an internalization of meaning. When a church is no longer a tribute, when a war is a cynical result of greed, when a great musician is simply an ego needing attention, what is left? Now that experience is judged higher than external results, psychology has naturally gained ascendancy. This has invariably placed society into a diagnostic mode, always trying to attribute mental pathology to anything that deviates from the norm. It also severs our connection to reality. Why build anything if the only real significance lies inside the mind? Why take any risk if the payoff is simply some chemicals firing in the brain? To escape from this, I suggest we become more careful with the language of psychology. The most effective tools are often the most capable of destruction, after all. Psychology should be selectively applied, with a far greater reverence for ritual and protected spaces. I am reminded of the film Whiplash, which fundamentally questions the cost-benefit of greatness. The question at its heart is whether one should go out in a blaze of glory, suffering for one's craft, or slowly and peacefully submit to old age. Society has already decided that the latter is preferable, and psychology is its most persuasive messenger. Now here I am, discussing the crisis of apathy. Number 4. Ignorance and comfort. Ignorance and comfort are, of course, constant factors resulting in apathy. By resigning oneself from the world, one may find a certain tranquility, yet this is often at the expense of a larger, more impactful project. In their defense, humans did not evolve in conditions which forced them to cooperate in global projects. As international attempts at unity grow, the situation has become far more complicated, and we should be conscious of how debilitating this can be. Action can still be encouraged, but the rhetoric is often less effective if it emphasizes the sheer scale of the problem, or descends into fearmongering. After all, this is what often leads to resignationism in the first place. By reframing in terms of what can be done and what is already working, by celebrating victories and showing how external-facing action can empower individuals, it may be possible to make people active who otherwise would have been passive observers. I recognize the irony, given how large-scale the issues I am discussing are. This is where compartmentalizing action and philosophy can be useful. Number 5. Modernity and its discontents. I would be remiss not to address the conditions of modernity. I have saved this for last because it is downstream of the previous corrections. A society cannot reorganize at the systemic level without first producing a critical mass of conscientious, life-affirming, and competent members at the ground level. Technology from surveillance to artificial intelligence have made real change feel more and more difficult to achieve. When there are cameras on every corner and on standby in every person's pocket, it can be extremely daunting for youth to express themselves. The social cost for any embarrassing mishap can be amplified 100-fold, being exposed both to a larger audience and for a longer time. I heard one proposal to ban phones in certain involuntarily entered spaces, allowing people opportunities to express themselves without fear of being recorded. This would be at least a small step towards providing youth with protected spaces for healthier psychological development. As for artificial intelligence, the danger it poses in creating the conditions for apathy cannot be understated, but the situation is by no means black and white. Any attempt at resolution is far beyond the scope of this essay. However, it is a subject I wish to address in future videos. Here are my final remarks. Almost everyone has an intuitive sense for why apathy is such a corrosive feeling in human life. It manifests as an overbearing heaviness and lethargy. Worst of all, it is a contagious symptom, transmitting its underlying disease through ideas, systems, and even social interactions. The positive side is that many of the conditions producing its underlying disease conditions are novel and still malleable. By reducing the interference of psychology in daily life, being careful about which implicit values are being cultivated in our orientating narratives, and replacing useful beliefs rather than simply destroying them, we can begin to treat some of the diseases now epidemic in culture. I wish I could narrow the source down to one variable, but that would be philosophically dishonest. If we allow ourselves to see this as a process and a challenge, resisting strong, absolutist claims on either side, we can finally begin to make true progress on this frontier.